This is Rob Johnson, President of the Institute for New Economic Thinking. I'm with Ajay Chhibber today to discuss his new book, Unshackling India, Hard Truths and Clear Choices for Economic Revival. He co-authored the book with Salman Soz. This is the kind of model of what I think we need to do. Everybody knows how to whine about what's wrong. You are creating a pathway to a constructive future and a vision based on a lot of experience in the Indian government, at the United Nations, at the World Bank, and many dimensions, which we can talk about in bits and pieces. But I really want to turn it over to you. But before we, glide down the pathway of your vision, what inspired you to write this book?
Well, thank you, Rob. It's so nice to see you again. And the book, I'll just hold it up just for a second so that people can see what it kind of looks like. But, there are two big motivations to write the book. Salman Soz and I, we come from the same college in Delhi, and we worked at the World Bank together, but not together, actually. I never knew him, either in college or in the World Bank. He's a little bit younger than me. That's why I didn't know him in college, but somehow our paths never crossed. So we met each other about 2 years ago, and we liked each other's views, and we said, perhaps we'll write a book. But then suddenly we had the pandemic, and then we said, now we must write the book because we have time on our hands and, a kind of motivation to write. So there were two big things that were in our mind. One was that, both of us have worked in many countries around the world and in India. And so Salman also worked on a range of middle-income countries, so did I. And we said, look, whenever we go back to India and, there are some problems and you say, here's a solution that others have tried that has worked, the response you get in India is always, well, this is never going to work in India. India is so different. India is, completely, it's like India is, very, very unique in some way. But lo and behold, over time, you'd find that people would come back to those solutions struggling, but often very late. And people also in India like to say, we're doing much better than we were 10 years ago or 20 years ago, which is true to some extent. But then the rest of the world hasn't stood still. They have gone much further ahead. And we know China, South Korea, so many countries have gone way past India. So you sort of say, well, you've got to bring a perspective that India is doing okay in some areas, badly in others, but where is it relative to what the rest of the world is doing? And so we tried to do this book as a bit of a benchmarking exercise, a kind of backward sort of indexation, which Indians love to do, but also a lateral indexation. So where are we and why are we where we are? That's one motivation for the book. The other motivation for the book is that India had very big reforms in 1991 when Dr. Manmohan Singh was the finance minister of India. And India got into a huge crisis after 40 years of pretty dirigious sort of socialist policies. And then came a huge, a balance of payments crisis. And that triggered the wave of reforms that Dr. Manmohan Singh brought about. But when he brought his reforms about, he had a clear vision of how things come together and which are the buttons that I have to press now at this stage for India to propel it forward. And so over a period of 3 to 4 years, he was able to press those buttons with a competent team around him and, move things forward. So you've come now some 20, 30 years later, and those reforms have run out of steam. And for the last 10 years, India has been kind of drifting, especially since the global financial crisis. And then you've got a new government that comes under Prime Minister Modi. And you think, wow, this is the man who's sort of the big reformer, and he's going to carry out some big reforms. And what you find, and what we've documented in the book, is that you've got these very one-off, piecemeal kind of things, because there's nobody there, either in his team or around him, with that kind of comprehensive vision of what are the different wheels that have to move in some sort of tandem for, whether it's on education or labor reforms or other reforms. So one reason to write the book, we thought, was, let's present a picture of how things come together to produce certain outcomes. And why does India have such a sort of distorted structural transformation? Just to give one example. So the part of the book was, let's present a picture of where India has been over the last 75 years that has brought it to this point, at its 75th year of independence, and then where does it need to go over the next 25 years, and how does the different parts of that sort of gearbox have to be moved in a way that will make it move forward in the right direction. So that's the second motivation for the book.
So when you look at, Vishmat, as you were saying, things kind of leveled off or stalled out a little bit.
Right.
Obviously, the pandemic is a bit of a shock. The urgency of climate change on the horizon
Yes.
is facing us all.
Yes.
But how would I say, how much do those specific factors
Right.
play into your design, and how much was what you might call related to a structure that wasn't functioning well before all of this came to the surface?
Absolutely, Rob. So, what we show in the book is that what the pandemic has exposed in stark terms what the bigger problems were. The problems were there already. The economy had already, since about 2016, had started to slow down. And particularly the last 2 years before the pandemic, the growth of the Indian economy had gone back to pre-1990 days, when India was growing at a very slow rate. One famous old economist who was my professor at the Delhi School of Economics, and I quote him in the book, Professor Raj Krishna, used to say, jokingly call it the Hindu growth rate, 4%, 4-5%. And what had happened was that in the last 2 years before the pandemic, we had gone back to now 4-5% growth. So we were back to, jokingly, I would say, back to the Hindu growth rate. And obviously, not a very good thing to say to a Modi government that is, kind of Hindu majoritarian is their ethos anyway. So I said, you brought us back to the old Hindu growth rate. But what the pandemic did is then expose those problems and why we were in that situation. Even before the pandemic, we had very high rising inequality. If you look at Piketty's book, India is either the most unequal or the second most unequal country among the large economies of the world. Maybe in some Gini coefficient measure, slightly less unequal than Russia. But if you look at the top 10% share of their income, then India is actually even goes beyond Russia. And so, and now what the pandemic has done has actually increased that inequality even further. The rich Indians have done much, much better, and the poor group have fallen even further behind. So, but what the pandemic has also exposed is certain things that were not so obvious, such as how weak the capacity of the state was to handle the pandemic. How many lives were lost that need not have been lost because of the weak capacity of the administrative capacity of the state. So I think it was sort of things needed a big change, but the pandemic has certainly been a huge wake-up call that has exposed these problems to an even greater extent than was the case before. And the fact that India had a very vulnerable employment. India has had about 80% of India's people who actually even work. A lot of people don't work because they can't find jobs. But even those who can find some job to do, 80% of them have what the UNDP calls vulnerable employment. That is, they have no safety net, they have no social protection. And that was exposed during the pandemic in spades, because when Mr. Modi did his drastic lockdown, and then about over 100 million people were then streaming back from the cities to the villages. It looked like some sort of a war or a story scenes that India had not seen since the partition of India and Pakistan. Of so many people
it's kind of like
out on the
it's
streets.
like the Wizard of Oz in reverse.
Yeah. and it showed that the vulnerability of this economy was huge.
Mm-hmm.
Okay?
Mm-hmm.
So I think what the pandemic has done is really exposed all this to a very great extent, and the weak health system, the weak administrative capacity, the inequalities, the lack of safety nets. And that's what we say now. We need to focus on these things going forward, but also somehow to be able to revive this economy from the slump that it had gotten into even before the pandemic. So today you will hear projections from the IMF that India this year will be the fastest economy in the world. Well, the main reason for that is that we had the biggest decline during the pandemic. So that's just a bounce back. They are projecting again that India will grow 9% next year. But I don't see where that growth is going to come from unless we do some serious reforms. And that's what we try and lay out in the book.
So in your title is the word unshackling.
Right.
So as we move into where India is,
Yes.
and like you said, to be kind of silly about it, the unmasking that the pandemic has done
Right.
has shown us some of the needs, some of the
Yes.
fault lines. But what shackles need to be taken off?
The biggest, the one very major point of our book is that the role of the state needs to be changed in very fundamental ways. That the state is not too large in terms of share of spending as a share of GDP. We have tables on that where we benchmark India against all the OECD countries plus several emerging market economies. But so the size is not too large, but the scope of the state, that is the number of things it tries to intervene into, is too large. And what that does is, it's a bit like, in taxation, you have the Laffer curve, right? If you try and tax at a very high rate, you start losing tax revenue. So here I use the Laffer curve sort of same methodology to show that if a state tries to do too many things, it ends up doing most of them very badly. And so the effectiveness of the state starts to go down. And that's what's happened in India.
So instead of being a catalyst or a channel upward,
Yes,
it's like throwing a net on top of things,
yes,
and stifling
yes,
vitality.
There's a famous writer in India, Gurcharan Das. He said most of India grows at night when the state is actually sleeping. So we actually devote the first 3 chapters of our book to what needs to be done here. And we argue that it's got to be a 2-part strategy. You can't improve the capacity of the state overnight. That'll take time. But the first thing you can do is reduce its scope, meaning make it focus on a fewer set of things. And Modi has Prime Minister Modi has a big slogan on this. He calls it maximum governance, minimum government. Obviously not an original one, probably taken from somewhere else. But so we say, well, if that's your slogan, then the first thing you need to do is refocus the state on fewer things, and things which you have neglected badly, like health and education, and even defense. If you take out the pension component of the armed forces of India, we have a very large army. The actual spending on real defense spending as a share of GDP is one of the lowest since independence, which is amazing given the threats that India faces. We have China, and we have a problem with Pakistan and loads of other issues that India has to deal with, but particularly China. And to have a sort of a nationalist strongman government have the lowest spending on defense because it's not able to move money from other various things that it's involved in, like building toilets and things, which are not bad, but I mean, that's not what a government's function should be. First, focus on health, education, defense. So that's one big theme we have in the book, which is where partly the title Unshackling India comes from. But then we say that it's over-centralized. China is a very authoritarian, totalitarian state, but more than 50% of spending in China is done at the local government level, not even at the provincial level, certainly not at the central level, at the local government, at mayors and village communes and those sorts of level of government. In India, that number is close to 4%. 4% of GDP is spent by mayors and village councils and things like that. Over 50% in China. To the level of so we argue that part of the reason why this government is ineffective is that there's and I use a methodology that was developed by a famous public administration expert and apply that to India, where we show that when you have things where the number of transactions is too high and the outcomes are not very specific, like in health and education, then trying to do those things in an overly centralized manner means you're not going to get the results that you need. So that's a big theme of our book, that we show that much greater decentralization, much greater, devolution to the lower level, and also that you will be able to get more for your buck at the lower level because salaries at the lower level are much less than at the central level. So we lay all this out in the book in the first 3 chapters. And also that we have still, while we may have liberalized in 91, we still have about 250 state-owned enterprises, public sector entities. We've just sold one, Air India, which is a marquee sort of airline, which was, a bleeding ulcer rather than a crown jewel, as Arun Shourie, a former minister who was in charge of privatization at one time, describes it. So, but I said, just as we were writing our book, the sale of Air India was on the sort of burner. And I said, this should be a litmus test. Can they do this or not? And they were finally able to do it and hand it back to the private company Tata's, from which they nationalized the airline. So that's another big agenda that they have to pursue, that we push for over the next 10 years or so.
When I had been traveling to India quite frequently, 2010 to 2016, I noticed quite large variations in local spending in different regions. It was not as if there was even if it was centrally controlled, it wasn't allocated as though it was a national policy. It seemed kind of like there was a customized policy for each area, and it appeared to me to be perhaps exacerbating inequality. And some
Right.
of the leaders of regions that I would meet with would be very enthusiastic if they were in the inner circle and very despondent if they were outside. And your fellow Indian countryman and leader, Raghu Rajan, is a friend of mine, and I remember him starting work as he left the central bank on his book that I think became called The Third Pillar. We
Right.
made a video together, and he was talking about at global levels, but also within India, at least in our conversation, that the need for local government is because you're sensitive to what people need there.
Yes.
But at some level, the federal government has to unify things across regions, manage migration between regions,
Yes.
and what you might call local officials can't insulate their population from all the shocks that occur.
That's
You
true.
do need the combination of the big overarching government and the sensitivity
Yeah.
down in the fields of where
Yeah.
people live and where their yearnings are identified.
Yes. So we show in our book very similar that when it comes to natural disasters, we get lots of cyclones and earthquakes and various types of which countries are hit. But being a large country, we are able to handle now a lot of those disasters on our own. Unlike large parts of the developing world, India doesn't look for foreign assistance when it gets, because you have a central government that is able to move resources, and an agency like FEMA you have in the United States, we have the National Disaster Management Authority. So there are things that India is able to run an election across the whole country very well. India is able to have a pretty competent central bank. It has the manpower and the capacity to do that. But then you ask the question, why can't it deliver basic health and education, right? Because it's tried to over-centralize everything there. And these are attributes or kind of services that are best delivered at the local level. India is a country more diverse than the European Union. So if you're trying to do whatever you are trying to do in Norway and you're trying to do that in Greece, it's probably not going to work, right? Similarly for us, you have, very states at different levels of development. And even within states, you have districts. You have some states which are the size, Uttar Pradesh would be the fifth largest country in the world. So you have within states, you have also huge variation. So you cannot do these things at a centralized level. And that's what we try and show in the book, that you do need an overarching framework, but the implementation has to be left to the local level, and the modification of that national policy has to be allowed. We just passed the national education policy at the national level. But now if they try and ram that down to all the districts and all the states, it's not going to work. You have to say, this is the framework. Now we are going to allow different districts, different parts of the country to implement this in a local manner that meets certain broad objectives and standards, but gets delivered in different ways in different states. So that's where we need to go.
It's the old adage, different strokes for different folks. And I think, but that sensitivity to the variations in the regions, I think is very important. I grew up in Detroit, Michigan, where after the devastation of the auto industry, many things were not performing. And in many ways, people in Detroit felt that the federal government had divorced Detroit. After the Voting Rights and Civil Rights Act were passed, Democrats in the South didn't want to transfer a lot of money to an African American majority city in the North. And so it was very, very dysfunctional. And then people swooped in, whether philanthropic or government officials, to take over the education system.
Right.
And it felt like to the people there, they have no idea what they're doing. They don't see the problems. They don't feel the problems. And and at the same time, by the way, they were building up the prison system. And then when a lot of black males were put into the prison system, which, by the way, were privatized and had incentives to fill their beds, then dysfunctional families did worse in schools. And as Heather Ann Thompson wrote about, she's a professor at the University of Michigan, all kinds of teachers who were being ranked on the standardized test scores of children left Michigan because they couldn't control their fate. And it was calamity from a top-down imposed thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to give you a similar example, a friend of mine runs a very good, what Raghuram Rajan, was describing, a very good NGO, Seva Mandir, which runs these schools in these villages. His school has one teacher. And all the villages around in that area send their children to his school. And the government has 9 schools with no teachers. The teachers never show up. Beautiful buildings, computers, all never even unpacked. This little NGO school, people are moving from other villages to this village in order to be able to send the children to this school.
Wow.
And this one teacher is running 3 shifts in a day to be able to handle all these kids. So this is the reality, that if you leave things down at the local level, then people will know what to do. Anyway, so
what in the realm of education, when you take the temperature of what's happening across the country, are there, I can understand being more customized, being more local, being more sensitive, but are there what I'll call mega or meta missing ingredients that you recommend in your book as a wholesale transformation?
The most obvious is obviously the amount of money. We have benchmarked India against all the neighboring countries, and we are underspending hugely. For example, our public spending on health is only 1.3% of GDP. It should be at least 3% of GDP. And out-of-pocket expenses are 2/3 of the spending is out of pocket by people. They have no insurance, and they go to half-baked, private clinics and hospitals. Same is in education. The amount of public spending in education, public schools, what in the United States, what we are calling public schools, is very, very low. So most of the people have drifted into private education. And so you have these fly-by-nights little schools that come up, private sector schools. Somebody will set up a school in their house in the locality, and all the children will go there, because when they go to the pub, at least here there's a teacher, there's somebody who's trying to teach you something. Whereas in the public school, the teacher may never show up. And even if the teacher shows up, he may never bother to actually teach. So you have those sorts of issues as well across, not just in the rural areas, but across the whole country. So you have a governance problem and a money problem at the same time. You don't have enough resources, and you need a governance structure which changes the whole incentives. Now, what we have is we have seen an increase in enrollment, but the quality now we need to focus on, and which is the direction we push for in our book. We have a very good NGO which has been doing surveys for the last 15 years, and produces the annual survey of education results, which tells you that if you went to class 5 or class 2, at what grade are these children able to perform? And she shows systematically, and does this by every state in the country, how poor the quality of the education is. So that's where we need to now focus hugely, and this is where this new education policy comes in. But again, it's how it gets implemented will be very important.
I was going to say, from the distance, from my perspective, number one, with the advent of technology and automation, knowledge-intensive human capital is becoming ever more important. And secondly, when I have seen the products of the best parts of your education system, when I visited India or when people from India come to the United States, this is not what you might call a genetic or some kind of failure. This is a missed opportunity. You have lots of brilliant people, and if you were to increase the allocation of resources, the vitality, the productivity, the payoff to that input, I think, is almost guaranteed. And almost all of the parents I've ever met from India really cherish seeing their children educated. So I think unleashing these resources is just a win-win-win for the system and individuals and the world.
Absolutely. But, we trace back over the last 75 years why we came to this situation. And part of it is that in the beginning, when we got our independence, we focused a lot of our resources on what I would call tertiary education. We established, the famous IITs and the Indian Institutes of Technology and Science, etc. But most of those people, including Raghuram Rajan, they all went there. They all leave the country. A lot of them just leave the country. And we neglected primary education hugely. So we did not create a mass of people who were reasonably well educated. We had a small group of people who were in the best of the best, and then we had a lot of people with very, very poor or almost no education at all. So there was that problem, but that problem then starting to being corrected now to some extent.
People who have what you might call faith in the parable of meritocracy are saying
Yes.
The talented ones emerged and the others didn't. But there's an awful lot of statistical data. I'm thinking now about work I see in the United States where students who test very well but are in the lowest quarter of the income distribution have much lower chance of getting a college degree than children who are in the upper 10% of the income distribution who finish in the lowest 25% on standardized testing. So there are a lot of things other than what you might call measures of innate ability or aptitude at work here. And it seems that investment that you're talking about, the broad-based uplift, can make an enormous difference.
Exactly, and that's what we are seeing. Our educator, Karthik Muralidharan, who teaches at University of San Diego, he's a guy who does a lot of work, and we quote him. He says, the whole system is now basically a signaling device. It's not a learning.
Yes.
It's not a system for learning. and even the richer parents, what they do is they know the child is not going to learn in school. So then they have after school tuition, and they pay a lot of money to people who come and then teach their children what they should have been taught in school. And so you have this intense competition for, very few jobs. You have intense competition for getting into a college. And so the way the richer parents do is they provide extra help to their children, which the poor cannot provide. Then you have the digital divide. You have people who have computers and people who don't. And we show the numbers on that as well. So you think of India as an IT power, but, there is a huge digital divide within India as well. And these days, without knowing computers, without, doing that kind of learning, you're nowhere, right? I mean, you cannot find the jobs in today's world unless you have that basic literacy, not just in reading and writing, but now in some at least basic computing. Now, of course, everybody has a cell phone these days, so through the cell phone, and we have very low data cost, but very low speed also, as we point out in the book. But nevertheless, people have at least access to cell phone. There are about 1 billion cell phones in the country, so pretty much everybody has access to something of that sort. So they're beginning to catch up, but we need to push in this direction hugely.
Yeah, I remember when INET has had various projects related to curriculum reform, and I was in India, and someone said to me, don't take the curriculum that you generate and put it in an e-book that we have to get on the internet. Create a cell zone, create an app for the telephone, so people in the cell zone can get this free textbook, because it will be much more widely disseminated.
Absolutely.
That's fascinating. I've also heard that in many parts of African development in recent years. But
exactly.
The interesting thing to me here, also, just before we close out on education, and you talked a little bit about it, and there's a lady who was a famous author in Canada named Jane Jacobs, often wrote about cities, but her last book was called Dark Age Ahead. And she spoke about the fear of unemployment that our ancestors talked about coming from the Great Depression, and the need to educate citizens rather than just credentialize people who were getting into school to get the job they were afraid they were going to miss in a very hierarchical society economically. Yeah. And now it's kind of ironic because she was in Canada, which is less afflicted by these things, but she saw these trends coming. And the idea that comes back to my mind is you're talking about evolving the state, evolving the different ways in which things are done, bringing things to the local level. It feels to me like citizen education is very important, as distinct from getting credentials as an input to production. Both matter, but the balance between the two of them, I think, is very important to the health of the society.
Yeah, I mean, we need to have a system where people are actually learning rather than just attending. And we have ended up with a system where focus was on enrollment. So enrollment went up. They finally, through this school lunch program and various other programs, they managed to bring the kids into the schools. But now, whether they are learning, I mean, that's the key. And the learning can't be only in the school, of course. But, when somebody is there for 5 or 6 hours and they're not learning anything, that's a huge waste as well, I think.
I once visited a conference on the theme of economic justice. And the discussion among the group got to a place where it talked about health and education. Jim Heckman, who's worked a lot with INET, was the person who inspired me to join him and listen. But the notion of economic justice that was being used in the United States at that time is, if you get paid more than your marginal product, you're being subsidized. If you get paid less than your marginal product, you're being exploited. If you get paid your marginal product, that's economic justice. But you could be at a place of so-called economic justice where you couldn't support a family or a retirement or anything. And the question became, who is responsible for your marginal product? And the systems of health and the systems of education have an awful lot to do with your productivity that was beyond your control. They're system platforms. They're not individual laziness, initiative, or what have you. And the parable that it's all about the individual, I can understand assigning responsibility to the individual, but assigning responsibility in the context where, if they are vital, give their heart to it, they can get the ingredients, particularly health and education, so that they are productive and can support a meaningful life. Otherwise, it's not socially sustainable.
So it's not just education. Now we need to then say, where do we find productive jobs for these people? And in our book, we show that our labor laws are so terrible. Partly we inherited them from British times, but then we added even more complications to them, so that it is very hard to actually employ people. And what it does is it makes sure that 90% of the employment is in firms which are smaller than 10 people. In fact, 80% are in firms of size 1, which means it's just the one person. There's no other person being employed. So, and that's where the point about the marginal productivity comes in, that there are no jobs. And now we contrast India with Bangladesh next door. Same basic structures, same institutions. Bangladesh then got rid of the labor laws, right? Pakistan did not. So Pakistan is still stuck. So when India became India, Pakistan and India kept the laws, and both labor laws, and then made them even worse. When Bangladesh got independence in 71, they threw out the labor laws. So this big boom in textiles is not just because of labor laws. There are other reasons too, but a very large part of it is. So you see a huge improvement in female labor force participation in Bangladesh, and a decline in India, a decline in Pakistan. And so these girls who get some very basic education now are able to go to the textile factories and get jobs and become far more productive. I mean, they may still be getting exploited by the definitions you gave, but they're still getting far more productive and far better wages than they were working on the farm, right? So that's a big story. And when you point that out to people, that you're now being compared to Bangladesh, not just to Vietnam, or which are now, I lived in Vietnam as the World Bank director in Vietnam, and that's a completely different. They've gone to a whole different level, let alone China. So, but even next door, Bangladesh now is saying, look, and their textile firms are 7 to 8 times bigger than Indian firms. They are able to now compete so well internationally. They are able to provide a lot of employment. I mean, they're like sweatshops. They're not the role model of a factory, but what was your alternative? Well, your alternative was no unpaid work on the farm, basically. And so that's, I'm not suggesting that we need to produce factories like Bangladesh, but we need to have a mass of manufacturing jobs. And India has what Danny Roderick called, and we point out in the book, called premature deindustrialization. The service sector has boomed, but the manufacturing sector, which is where the bulk of the employment needs to take place. If you go back to, say, Sir Arthur Lewis's sort of dualistic transformation of how people move out of agriculture and out of the informal sector into more formal jobs and more productive jobs, and getting better paid, and having a wage that, is not working poor. In India, you have a lot of people just working odd jobs, but they're still poor, below the poverty line, right? So that's the kind of transformation that we need to have, as we show. And what would it take to do that? It would be education, but and basic health, because a lot of kids are also malnourished, and it would require some fund. So what India has done is taken its most abundant asset, which is labor, and made it very difficult to use it. It's taken its most scarce resource, which is land, and wasted it. And we show in our book, wasted in 2 ways. One is that the floor area ratio in our urban cities is one of the lowest one of the lowest in the world. So when your land is so scarce, you start to urbanize, and then you have these sprawling cities Delhi is 30 miles by 30 miles. That city could absorb all those people in probably 1/3 the area that it now occupies. So you take your most scarce resource and you use it badly. You take your most abundant resource and you use it. You don't use it at all. In fact, so little employment in the country. So how do you compete with anybody? And then what we did was we took the third factor, which is capital, and we ended up with, and we show in the book, the most inefficient banking system in the world. It compares to Venezuela and Russia, which are, oligarch-run systems. So we show that the intermediation ratio, which is sort of what's the difference between the deposit rate and the lending rate, is in India is now 500 to 600 basis points. And that's because what we've done is we nationalized the banking system. Then all the crony capitalists and the populist politicians started handing out free loans or, re-greening the loans of crony capitalists who were willing to pay bribes to politicians. So I write in the book that this is like a murder on the Orient Express. Who's responsible for this? And they say, it's everybody. They all stuck the knife in. It's the regulator, it's the crony capitalist, it's the crooked politician or the populist politician, and the bank manager, who's basically in a state bank. You're the bank manager because the politician wants you there to do his bidding. So we've ended up with this huge non-performing assets, and then the only way the bank can survive is by increasing the disparity between the lending rate and the deposit rate. So, when you look, so this is where the reforms have to take place, that the first generation reforms that Dr. Manmohan Singh did were basically, in what we call, economists call product markets. But the next stage of reforms, which India needs to do, are in labor, in land, in capital. And these cannot be done by the center alone because these are very heavily, provincial state subjects. So we can't do these reforms like they were done before. And a lot more discussion, dialogue, etc., has to take place between the center and the states to make this happen. And that's not happening in India.
I'm reminded of one of my earlier podcast guests, a young woman from, I believe she's from Singapore, but is at University of Michigan. Her name is Yung Ang, and she wrote a book called China's Gilded Age, The Paradox of Economic Boom and Vast Corruption. And she compared the Chinese with the 19th century Americans and the concentration in the railroads and concentration of finance, J.P. Morgan. And she was essentially saying sometimes the corruption is used as propulsion, but if you will, creates systemic growth or a step in the ladder onto better things, then it's okay. But when the corruption becomes kind of stultifying, it stops the system from feeling any possibility of promise or future prospect. And I'm going to, when we finish this podcast, I'm going to send it to her because I want to see what she thinks would be the recipe for India in light of your book. I'll get her a copy of your book, and because it's a fascinating set of challenges that you're building this mosaic of many different dimensions that need to transform, at least closely in time, not necessarily simultaneously.
Corruption will be corruption. I call it not the second oldest profession in the world. I call it the oldest profession in the world. But so we're not going to ever eliminate it altogether. But we need to get it to a level where it doesn't become, as you said, stultifying, right? So how do we do that? And we argue that one is massive deregulation. So, just we used to have, when we didn't have the telecom, mobile telephony, it was so difficult to get a telephone in India, and people would pay enormous bribes to get it. But now, with the mobile telephone, we don't need to get the landline, so nobody pays a bribe there. Similarly, for many other things, when you had these monopolies, but more competition, more transparency, more deregulation, I think is the way forward to reduce corruption. When people will have other opportunities to get the service, then by itself the corruption will come down. And also more IT, a lot of the services are now done through the internet. So I think that makes a huge difference also to the level of corruption. We do have very high political corruption in India. We have electoral bonds, which are completely non-transparent. You're not required to even reveal who. So they've set up this electoral bonds, and anybody can buy them, but you don't have to reveal who you are. So a company can buy BJP-related electoral bonds or Congress Party-related bonds and never have to reveal who they are, except, of course, they inform the party concerned that they are buying their bonds and that a quid pro quo would be required, right? So suddenly all that corruption that was so visible has now become invisible to some extent. So you get the feeling that India is less corrupt, but it's just become more corporatized and regularized in some way. And in that sense, I guess there's progress because it's going more the American way.
Though I think in the United States, as I was listening to you just now, I can see all of these dilemmas because there are, which you might call platforms, with increasing returns that look like a monopoly.
Yes.
And then there's what you might call restraint of trade, which is increasing profit margins and reducing the dissemination of things that enhance our well-being. How we construct antitrust in the age of internet and technology platforms with those increasing returns characteristics is a very important challenge. And then how, if we allow those monopolies, for society not to be what you might call subject to the whims of just a handful of people when it's meant to be a democracy is another challenge.
So I've in our book we point out that we are probably headed towards a Latin American style, or a plutocracy of some sort rather than a real democracy, because the number of people now who control a very large part of the economy is growing fewer and fewer, and are all well connected with the political party in power, and have very vast ambitions. I mean, we are going towards the Gilded Age that America got out of eventually, but we are headed in that direction, and very rapidly. As the Piketty book shows, the increase in inequality has been the fastest in India. James Crabtree, I don't know if you know him. He used to be the Financial Times correspondent in India. He wrote a whole book called The Billionaire Raj.
The other person who is resonating with these thoughts is a man who encouraged me to watch for your forthcoming book, Kishore Mahbubani. Okay. He's, I believe, originally from India, but is in Singapore.
Oh, yeah.
He has a new book called The Asian 21st Century. And he talks about how the American leadership wants us to emulate them as the head of a world system.
Yes.
But with all of the problems that are occurring in the United States with concentration and what he says, I think he wrote an article with this title in the Straits Times, for the 1%, by the 1%, of the 1%. as the democracy
Yes.
that everyone's supposed to emulate in the U.S.-China standoff.
Yes.
But so he's
Yes.
concerned about the evolution of the structure of the United States and an Asian model which is
Yeah.
less focused on individual liberty. I'm talking about philosophically, the Taoist and Indian traditions, and more aware of the common good. He's almost presenting in his previous book, I think, called Will China Win, and in conversations I've had with him, that we are at a place where the tectonic plates of two different philosophical systems are in tension.
Yes.
But it's hard to see how, given
Yes.
the performance of America, that people are going to want to emulate that system, given the stage that it's in.
Yes.
So,
So I don't know Kishore at all, actually. So what happened was that I read a talk he gave recently in India on why India can beat China. And it was the one of the former president memorial lecture that he gave in India last year. When I read that, I really liked it, and I quote him in the book. But then I sent him the book and said, I really enjoyed your lecture, and by the way, I've put you in my book, but here's my book. Let me know what you think. And he said, oh, I love your book. He read it after 2 weeks. He said, I love the book. And I said, will you endorse it? And he said, yes, I'll endorse it. So he's endorsed the book. Where I differ with Kishore is on China. And the part that I differ with him is that he thinks China and India will get together. And I told him that what China wants is not an Asian century. China wants a Chinese century. They don't want India playing any part in it. And the joke I tell him is that in the Forbidden City, the question that people should be asking is, who lost India? And the answer is, it was not who, it was she. Because, there was no reason for us to have a problem with China, except China has become so belligerent. And our former Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi met Deng Xiaoping. And, we had a war with them in 1962, so we had strained relations. And they both agreed that from now on, China and India will focus on economic development and not on the disputes with each other. So that stood for about 30 years till Xi Jinping has come to power. And Xi Jinping is the belligerent one in this, because Modi has tried very hard to, he's had 7 or 8, these peace summits with him, and somehow in the end, still we've ended up with a problem.
and with the Belt and Road Initiative, and in Africa, there's a sense, some of my friends in India have often, as they visited me in the last 2 or 3 years, expressed a lot of concern about feeling a bit surrounded. And surrounded isn't just large, it's about feeling threatened as well. Like the belligerence has got to be a part of that mix for it to be frightening. So I concur with what you're saying.
Yeah, so it's, but I like Kishore otherwise.
Well, I just pulled up his endorsement. I'm going to share with the audience. He said, can India have the largest economy in the world? Yes, it can. Yet success is never easy. But Ajay Chhibber and Salman Soos have done India a huge service by documenting comprehensively the reforms, both painful and painless, that India should undertake. India should set aside its partisan divide, heed their wise advice. India should not rely only on its $2.7 trillion market when a global market of $80 trillion dollars beckons. If overseas Indians can compete successfully in global markets, so can India. And if India bravely jumps into the global market, India's economy will explode and seize the moment. That's pretty enthusiastic. I'd say you got an A+ out of that one.
Yes. But I must tell you that I'm a great admirer of Singapore. And in the book, I provide a little anecdote of when Mrs. Indira Gandhi visited Singapore at the invitation of Lee Kuan Yew. After she'd been shown around the city, this is like in the 70s, and the pesky Indian journalist asks her, "Madam, aren't you impressed with what you have seen?" And she, in her very haughty, arrogant manner, says, "Oh, but it's just a city. I can build 20 of these any time." And the journalist says, "Madam, why don't you? It will totally transform our country."
That's great.
So Modi has this idea of building 20 cities along the coastline, and they're starting with two big projects now, one on the west coast, one on the east coast. So they're picking up these ideas of port-led development, which is. But then at the same time, they are reversing the reforms that were done by Dr. Manmohan Singh, which is the trade reform, and that's the part I wanted to come to. That this bit about returning to protectionism and not joining RCEP, not joining trade agreements, this reversal, what they call Atam Nirbharta or self-reliance, is beginning to sound more like the import substitution which led us to the old Hindu growth rate. And unless India gets out of this mindset, they think that we have a very large domestic market. And I tell them that, the second largest economy in the world is China. The third largest economy in the world is Japan. The fourth largest economy in the world is Germany. You're fifth or sixth. And these two, the number two, number three, and number four, are the most aggressive exporters in the world. So why do they not think they have a large enough market? There's $100 trillion market out there in the world.
Yes.
Why is your $3 trillion market?
And the Scandinavians, while they aren't
It's not
on scale, the quality of life per capita is so high, and they have that same strategy that you've referred to. Like,
exactly. So I said, why do you guys focus on your domestic market and think it's a large market? It's not. And the Swami that they revere, Swami Vivekananda, when he came in 1850, when he came to Chicago at the World Forum of Religions, and they said, they asked him about India and its place in the world, and he said, "Look, we enter the world like a gymnasium to make ourselves strong." And the other example I give in the book is the cricket team of India. We learned cricket from the British, and for a long time, an Indian team could never win outside of India. It only won on Indian wickets, nasty wickets. But India's cricket team did not retreat into protectionism. It kept going out and trying to, and now we are the world's best. We can beat anybody, including England, anytime, right? So I said, learn from your own cricket team. Why do you think you will be world beaters in almost anything? And that's what Kishore is saying. Look at the Indians who go out. They become the best everywhere. So why won't you?
I know people will call me if we don't explore the role of India in climate change. And I know that's a part of your book because I went through that in preparation. But let's talk a little bit about coal transformation, scale, poverty, health systems. What are the highest and best uses of budgets? And what role should the world play? I mean, I'm going to breathe the air and oxygen if you succeed. In other words, I don't think India should be alone in investing in India's climate transformation, energy system transformation, because you're contributing to the global public good after the global north has burned most of the carbon that's put us in this CO2 problem. So what's the domestic policy? What's the international support that you envision is both just and vital for India's future?
So Rob, 5 years ago, if you had asked me, I would have been very despondent on India's position. But today, and in the book we show, and now, of course, Modi went to Glasgow and also made this announcement of 2070. And India is now leading the Solar Alliance also. So the mood has changed in the country. The old mood was, we didn't create the problem. Why do we have to solve it? We are still very poor. We need all this development, which is true. But now India has realized that it is. So I used to argue when I was in the UN to the Indian authorities that it's like cutting your own nose to spite your own face, because after all, you're going to be the biggest losers as well. India is going to be a big loser if climate change goes beyond whatever 1.5%, because we have melting glaciers. And I produced a whole movie on this, on the Himalayas, and it was very popular. Showed it thousands and thousands of schools all over the world. And then we have, several of our cities will go underwater. We have typhoon, we call them cyclones in South Asia. So what are called hurricanes in the Atlantic and Pacific, they call them typhoons in Japan, and we call them cyclones. So all that. So, but now the mood has changed in India. There's no longer this sense that, oh, this is a Western or developed country problem. They're saying we are going to be part of the solution. Then the question comes, how serious, what has to be done? But I think the problem, the resistance has gone away. And now it's a question of what's the right path? How can we raise the money, as you said? And there, most people in India are very skeptical that the rest of the world is actually seriously going to provide much resources. But because they say there's a lot of talk, we don't see the kind of money. But I do think that the discussion has changed. And in our book, we say that, in fact, India should focus on green growth for job creation also. But now I feel we are pushing on an open door in India, and that this is the direction India will go. I never thought, I thought coal would still be 70-80% of our energy mix by 2050, but I don't think that's true anymore. I think it will be much less. And as we argue in our book, we say keep the damn thing in the ground till you find a way to that when you use it, you can cap it, capture the carbon and reuse it. But right now, I said that technology is too expensive, so we're best to leave it to the ground and put a huge push towards renewables, which is what I think they are doing. They're doing that in spades now. So I'm very positive that India will not be like China, which will have such large grounded thermal coal. China is now the third largest emitter in the world, and they're not going to be able to do anything about it because they have such a large amount of installed capacity already, and we don't. So we can make choices. And as we argue in our book, let's not follow the Chinese model, the pollute now and clean up later model. That's a nasty, expensive model. And we can leapfrog now, just as we've done in many other areas. So that's where I think India will go. And I don't see any kind of resistance to it anywhere, because we don't have large grounded assets we don't have 80% of our power capacity is still to be built. So we have choices.
Now, this is a big factor in the United States, which is, I'll use my place of origin, Detroit. People watched the transformation away from auto industry, globalization, automation, what have you, and they watched Detroit and Cleveland's people get crushed. So now people in West Virginia are saying, oh, it's great, climate change, wonderful for the world. How are you going to take care of us? You're not going to do to us what you did. In other words, there's resistance to change if there isn't adjustment assistance. The old adage in free trade theory, we can make everybody better off and nobody worse off, requires transformational compensation and adjustments and education subsidies and all kinds of things. You got to do the whole thing. In India, you do have an advantage that you don't have a whole lot of a sector that's going to get buried, because like you said, 80% is new, and it's maybe the opportunity cost for the other sectors that they didn't get to grow into it, but you're not knocking down something that was already built.
We are hoping that it will be less. And also, you see, we are realizing that a lot of the pollution is not just what you are emitting to the world, but now so many of our cities have very bad air, very bad water. And so it's in our backyard, and we have to clean up the whole thing anyway, not just for the rest of the world, but for ourselves as well. Yeah. So we have a whole chapter on this. We show this in a very systematic way and in a positive way going forward. But I have a feeling we are pushing on an open door on this. And the big industrialists in India are all going into renewables in a big way. You know, the Ambanis and the Adanis of the world, their projected investments in renewable is huge. Now, what we have to do is, right now we are still very dependent on China for the manufacturing of many of these, whatever is required for solar panels and things like that. And we have to move in that direction. So they have this PLI scheme, the Production Linked Incentive Scheme, to push in that direction. Because I think now the feeling is that we cannot be reliant on China for a lot of our production.
How would I say? One hopes that the feeling that climate change is for the common good involves what you might call, despite what other disputes, a collaboration on that front is. We all lose if we don't collaborate. So I think it's treacherous. It's frightening a bit, but I think that is the end game logic.
Yeah. And for us, you see, there's that movie I produced when I was at the UN on the Himalayas. So you have the North Pole and the South Pole, but the third biggest concentration of ice in the globe is the Himalayan ice belt. And that has huge implications for, I'm not a science guy, but I've read a little bit about it, but on the monsoons and, it has effects on climate that can be go at tripping points that can create irreversible situations that can be very damaging. So, for a lot of reasons, India must play a very positive role. But the interesting thing is, and we had a presentation the other day. It's not just this. You see, there's a lot of this fad about net zero, net zero, net zero. But as a lot of these people are pointing out, the path to net zero is very important too, because it's the accumulated emissions, not just getting to. So you could get to 2050, say, in the Western world. But you could, or China says 2060, but if China doesn't do anything till 2040 or 2050, and then but it would have eaten up the entire balance, that is CO2 balance that's left out there for us to get to. So people have become too enamored with these net zero targets, and that the glide path is very important also. Yeah. To get to that. But I'm hopeful that India will move will be a positive force in the world on this issue going forward.
I really want to pay tribute to you, because it's not just optimism, it's thoughtful optimism, given your experience, your intellect, the depth of your research. It's credible optimism. And I think this book is an extraordinary contribution, not only to the path forward in India, but to the path forward for intellectuals to make a contribution to the calming of nerves and our future well-being.
Thank you so much, Rob.